According to new numbers from the Centers for Disease Control, autism is now the nation's fastest growing developmental disability, striking 1 in every 166 children. So all this week, the networks of NBC News will be focused intensively on autism. It is a baffling disorder that impairs a child's ability to speak and interact with other people. An autism diagnosis is devastating to families. But in addition to being a medical and an emotional crisis, autism also carries with it a huge financial burden. Most treatments and therapies are not covered by medical insurance. Thomas Hiltychuk may look like a typical 4.5-year-old. He loves to play with his sister, jump on his trampoline, and watch The Wiggles. But Thomas is anything but typical. He doesn't speak, and he can't tolerate crowds or changes in his routine. Thomas is autistic.
When he was about 15 months old, Thomas, he had been talking and he stopped talking. He has a twin sister and he wasn't developing like she was. And that was immediately when we started to wonder if something wasn't going on.
Lynn and Yuri Hiltychuk took their son to a developmental pediatrician.
We didn't think that they were going to tell us he had autism, but that's what they told us.
Autism is a complex brain disorder that inhibits a person's ability to communicate, form relationships, and interact with people around them. Few disorders are as emotionally and financially devastating to a family. Over the last decade, the incidence of autism has increased from a rate of 1 in 2,500 children to 1 in 166. According to the Centers for Disease Control, autism is now the fastest growing serious developmental disability in the United States.
There's this sense that people have that for the first time they know somebody who knows somebody who has autism. And you find that almost any place you go.
There is no cure for autism, but one of the most promising therapies is applied behavior analysis, or ABA, which breaks down tasks and learning into very simple steps. In the 1970s, Dr. Ivar Lovaas of UCLA showed that 50% of autistic children who received 40 hours per week of ABA therapy developed enough skills to become indistinguishable from their peers.
Look at me. Yeah, look at me. That's good looking. That's good looking.
But with Tato. Awesome. Give me 5.
For ABA therapy to work, it needs to be intensive. One child working individually with a therapist. And it needs to be extensive, meaning 25 hours or more per week. All of this can cost families more than $5,000 a month. And most often, the fees are not covered by health insurance.
I want radio. Say Ray. D. O.
What we know about ABA is that it works for some children. And when it works, it can work very well. How it gets paid for is another question. It's a tremendous financial burden for one family, any family, to take on. And we don't want to be in the situation where only those of means have children who are going to be able to recover and be mainstreamed.
Insurance companies have been reluctant to cover ABA therapy, calling it experimental, investigational, and not medically necessary.
Medically unnecessary is a difficult thing to deal with. Does that mean that he'll die if he doesn't have ABA therapy? Well, no. But it does mean that he wouldn't have a fulfilling and normal life, that he wouldn't be a part of society.
And it's kind of a double whammy because, I mean, here you're trying to deal with the emotional side of it, and then you get hit financially on top of it.
That's why the Hiltychuks started their national campaign to get ABA covered by insurance.
Insurance companies traditionally love to avoid their responsibility.
New Jersey Congressman Chris Smith, chair of the Congressional Autism Caucus, is pushing insurance companies within the federal employees system to cover ABA therapy.
We can be trendsetters. as to what at least a minimum benefit ought to include. And then there's the peer pressure. If it's a benefit for us and every federal employee, why isn't it a benefit for GM and everyone else in corporate Americas?
The insurance industry wouldn't talk to us on camera about ABA coverage, but a trade group representing mental health care insurance providers did send CNBC this written response. It states, AMBA member companies have reviewed applied behavioral analysis and have determined that the treatment has not yet been proven to be effective.
It's bad enough you have the emotional part of this whole thing, of having a child with autism and dealing with the emotional aspect, but then when you start dealing with the financial parts of it, and the fights, and the just trying to get the care for your child that you need to get for him, it wears you down in a way that to me was unimaginable 2.5 years ago before he was diagnosed. Can I have a kiss? Mwah.
And our thanks to the Hilltaichuks for their time and their access, our access to their home. You know, they say they are actually lucky because though they have maxed out their credit cards, they have taken out a second mortgage, they have yet to be forced to sell their homes. A lot of families have to do that as a way to pay for ABA therapy. Some new numbers from the Centers for Disease Control now show that autism strikes 1 in every 166 children. There's some disagreement as to whether the increase is a true rise in incidence or just better diagnosis. But one thing that everyone in the autism community agrees on is the value of early intervention. In fact, the earlier the better. So imagine if autism could be diagnosed in the first few months of life, or perhaps even better, at birth. That's the goal of some promising new studies co-sponsored by the National Institutes of Health and the National Alliance for Autism Research. The project is called Baby Sibs because it focuses on the siblings of children with autism. Genetic research has shown that if a family has one child with autism, its chances of having a second child with autism are 1 in 15, well above the regular incidence of 1 in 166. The program tracks siblings of autistic children from birth to see if those who do develop the disability show common traits that could lead to new diagnostic tools.
Over the next 5 years, we're going to have new methods, a range of new methods, that will help us find children, infants at risk, maybe as early as 4, 5, 6, 7 months of age. And the hope is that if we can start the intervention very early, we'll be able, we hope, in many children to prevent much of the disability.
At Yale, Dr. Ami Klin and Warren Jones have used a special eye tracking device to show that while watching a video, a typical child focuses on the speaker's eyes, while an autistic child watches the speaker's mouth. Now the team is figuring out ways to track eye movements of infants to determine whether children who will go on to develop autism demonstrate this viewing pattern as babies.
The diagnostic value of this project has to do with the fact that we might be able to identify vulnerabilities even before the symptoms of autism emerge, and therefore we might be able to push back the identification of vulnerabilities to the first months of life.
At Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Baby Sibs research